All right, good evening. We hope you enjoyed your meal and the wonderful company that's at your table. It's our pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker this evening. The Honorable Murray Sinclair is Anishinaabe and a member of the Peguis First Nation. He is also Manitoba's first Indigenous Justice and the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In addition to his illustrious 40-year career in the justice system, Murray Sinclair was also appointed to the Senate in 2016, where he served for 5 years before retiring to return to practicing law and providing mentorship. Honorable Sinclair is also an advisor and elder to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
Honorable Murray Sinclair has many great achievements, as I know everyone in this room is aware of. But he has said some of his greatest achievements are being a father, a husband to his wife Catherine, and a mushum to his 5 grandchildren. And I like to remember this story that I'm going to share with you. I'm totally going off script. When I worked with Justice Sinclair at the Truth and Reconciliation, he often spoke of his granddaughter, Sarah. And he told this story one day about how Sarah asked him, "Mushum, are you a king?" Because we never know, Justice Sinclair, Senator Sinclair, Justinator Sinclair. We have all kinds of titles for him. But personally, for me, he's been such a great mentor, and was such an honor to work with him and be guided by him when I worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm so very honored that you're here tonight to share some words with us. So if the King Sinclair could come to the podium, that would be wonderful.
Bonjour, Nakanasatuk, Mizenagijik, Indigenous, can go down them. Thanks for that very kind and careful introduction. You could have said much more. And lucky for you, you didn't. So I want to also thank the two of you for inviting me to be part of this gathering, this very important gathering. I'd like to acknowledge, of course, my sister, the Elder Florence Painter, for the prayer that started us off here, and to the drum group, the Sons of the Drum, the young men who sang those songs for us this evening, and to all of the survivors, children of survivors, the grandchildren of survivors who are here this evening, all of the families of survivors, of course, and all of you who are working in the field of trying to do something about finding the lost and missing children, wherever they may be, and doing something about that. So I want to thank you for allowing me a few minutes of your time in order to speak with you about the topic of your conference, topic of your agenda, which has to do with dealing with the trauma of finding and looking for and finding the missing burial sites for the children who've gone missing from residential schools. Before I begin, though, the reference to my granddaughter, Sarah, Nimijian Nibikwe, reminded me that she has become one of my strongest advocates in the house. I live in a household with 4 women, well, 7 if you count the 3 female dogs, all of whom are against me, I should point out, and all of whom boss me around. And so, as a result, every once in a while I need an advocate. And one day, not that long ago, she's turned 16 now. One day, not that long ago, she was at the table with us, and my daughters were getting after me for the fact that I don't take care of myself. And my daughter said, "Dad, you used to be in such great shape when you were in high school. Look at these photos from high school when you were an athlete. And now you're not in shape. You got to get into shape." And at that point, Sarah stood up and she said, "Aunties, stop doing that to Mushum. Just look at him. Round is a shape," she said. And she has been one of my staunchest advocates and supporters throughout her life. She just recently won an Indigenous Youth Achievement Award the other night, and she's a flautist. She plays flute in Winnipeg Youth, Manitoba Youth Symphony Orchestra, and she's also the vice president of her student council at her high school. So she herself has achieved quite a significant amount of achievements in her lifespan for 16 years old. And so whenever I invite her to come along to one of my speaking gigs, she always negotiates how much of my speaking fee am I going to pay her. So we've agreed on 50-50. So whenever she's there, she gets 50% of my speaking fee. So she's saving up for a car, and she knows exactly what kind of car she wants. So my obligation is to contribute to that purchase when it's time for her to get one. Speaking of children, generally, I'm reminded of the importance of children in our lives and what they bring to us and what they give to us. And my neighbor was telling me about an incident that occurred not that long ago when he took his two children, his two daughters, one was 10, the other is about 5, to the Manitoba Museum of History. And the youngest one was walking around, and they have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission exhibit in there. And my photograph is very prominent on the wall near the TRC exhibit. And she stopped in front of the photo and she looked at it and she said, "Daddy, isn't that our neighbor?" And her dad said, "Yes, that's Murray, and he's part of this." And she said, "Wow." I said, "Imagine that." She said, "He's in a museum and he's still alive." So they remind us, of course, of the importance, because now she will stand on the deck of her house. She lives about a quarter of a mile away from us. She stands on the deck of her house, and whenever I go outside, she has this little trumpet horn, and she'll sound it, and when I have to look at her, she'll wave at me with her trumpet. I think she's checking to make sure I'm still alive. But children are important to us all. We know that because they're important to all of you. Think about your children, your little children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, what they bring to your life, what they do for you, how they make you feel, and how they make others feel as well. I was speaking at an event late last September with teachers on reconciliation, and the teachers were invited to bring their young children to the event so they could listen to what their moms and dads were learning. And so they all had their children in the room, and the children were gathered, and they were very quiet while I was talking. And then afterwards we did photos, and one of the teachers brought his little girl, who was about I guess about 3.5 years old. She wasn't quite in school yet, but she was very excited to come up and meet me because I had been speaking on the stage. And so we met, and I said hello, and they said, we'll do a photograph now. So I sat down, and she sat between us, and her dad was on the other side. And she kept looking up at me, and I could feel her looking up at me. And then she turned to her daddy, and she said, "Daddy, who is this guy?" And of course he said, "Well, this is Murray Sinclair. And he's a very famous man, and he's one of Canada's heroes." And she looked at me again, and she said, "You mean like Mickey Mouse?" And I turned to her and I said, "Yes. And Mickey Mouse saved Christmas, and I'm going to save Christmas too." So, but that's what we have to remember is going on in their heads, and that is that they see things a different way than we do. They see things in a much more simpler way, and in a way that allows them to express themselves in a loving way to those who are close to them. When I was at that conference, another teacher spoke to me, and he said that when he was at home, that he always invites his children at the dinner table to talk about what they learned during the day. And he said his 10-year-old son at the table said, "Well, Daddy, they talked to us about residential schools today, and they told us about all those children who got taken away and they got placed in those residential schools, and some of them died there and never came home. And some of them got hurt while they were there, and they couldn't be normal. They couldn't do what other people could do." And she said, and he said to his dad, "Daddy, I want you to promise me something." And his dad said, "What's that, my son?" He said, "I want you to promise that you'll never let that happen to me." And tears were coming off of that teacher's face, because he realized that that's exactly what happened to so many Indigenous students who got taken away, that happened to them. And he promised his son that that would never happen to his son. And if everybody, I get asked this question all the time, what can I do about reconciliation? I always tell people, you can do something as simple as making sure that this never happens again, and that it never happens to your children, and it never happens to anybody else's child either. Because children should never have been treated in this way. They should never have been separated from their mothers, their fathers. They should never have been separated from their communities. They should never have been brainwashed into believing that their cultures were irrelevant, that we were heathens, we were pagans, that we were backwards, that we were less than equal, that we were not as good as the Europeans who came here. We should never let our society continue that way again. So look at the public school system. For years, after residential schools had closed down, and even while they were operating, but after residential schools closed down, they were still teaching children, because I know it happened to me, that Indigenous people were inferior, Indigenous people were cold-hearted, that they were violent, they couldn't be trusted, that they had no rights, they didn't know what it meant to own property, that they didn't have any sense of governance, they couldn't invent things, they didn't know how to deal with modern society, that they were backwards, that they were lucky that white men came here and saved them, because otherwise they were going to become extinct. That was taught in the public schools. And I've always said that the public school system is probably more responsible for the damage that has been done to Indigenous children in this country than the residential schools were, because it was more inclusive. It had larger numbers of Indigenous children who are still feeling the impact of that in their lives. And we need to understand that. All of those who went to public schools in the course of their lives, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, carry the burden of those teachings. And it's not just Indigenous children who carried that burden, but non-Indigenous people did as well, because they were taught that not only were Indigenous people inferior, but they were taught that their ancestors from Europe were superior, and that therefore they were entitled to be in a more privileged position, and that therefore the relationship would always be one of unequals, because that's the natural order of things. The public school system has done a great deal of damage, and we need to understand that. And we need to understand that as part of the work that we're doing with ourselves, our communities, our families, that we have some work there to do as well. That's why I said at the end of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that it's education that got us into this mess, and it's education that's going to get us out of it. The way that we educate children in the future will be the foundation of reconciliation. And we need to understand how we can do that effectively. At an event that I spoke at here in Winnipeg a few years ago, somebody asked me, what does reconciliation really mean? And I said, well, you know, when we were doing the TRC work, we asked our staff to look up reconciliation and give us some definitions, and they came up with numerous definitions. You could look it up in all sorts of dictionaries, encyclopedias, and other sources, and come up with all sorts of definitions. And it means different things to different people. To accountants, reconciliation means getting things to be equal at the end. The columns on the left and the column on the right need to add up and be the same. A reconciliation to a lawyer means getting two people back together again, regardless of consequence down the road, regardless of what's happened between them to this point in time. So reconciliation has come to mean many different things, but reconciliation really turns on a very simple concept. I said then, and I say now. Reconciliation turns on the concept that I want to be your friend, and I want you to be my friend, so that if we are in a friendship state together, that when you need my help, I will give it to you, and when I need your help, you will give it to me without question, because we are people who are friends together in this country. Question always is, of course, will we ever get there? I think it's going to take a lot of effort. It took a lot of effort to create this damage to begin with. It took 150 years almost of work by governments, by churches, by societal institutions all over to create this damaged relationship, this damaged understanding that we have. And it's going to take us perhaps equally long in order to fix this. And it means that every year we have to ensure that those in charge of leading this country, in whatever capacity they are, whether it's an elected politician, or it's somebody who heads an institution, or it's somebody who speaks to children, or somebody who writes columns in a newspaper, that they understand what they are saying, and they understand that if they say it in the wrong way, that it can contribute to that damage further. And we need to get them to stop and to concentrate on fixing their knowledge base, because we have so much to do. With the discovery of those children's burial sites in Kamloops, what it did was it galvanized this country into understanding that this really did happen, that what we said in the TRC report really did happen, and that children were buried in graves, sometimes unmarked, often with more than one body in the grave, that children died at the schools. Sometimes children died at the hands of people who worked there, caused deliberately by them. And people are now beginning to think that, why did we allow these institutions to be here so long? And it's because they benefited you. It's because that policy benefited Canadians. It ensured that the lands that Indigenous people truly possessed and governed could be taken from them easily and could be transferred over to settlers, could be transferred over to explorers, could be transferred over to mining companies, to oil companies, to forestry companies without any question, because it was empty land. Nobody owned it. Therefore, it was available for the taking. I remember being at a dinner in Ottawa when I was in the Senate, and one of the people at the table, not a senator, but one of the people at the table said, "Why can't your people be like my great-grandfather? He arrived here, he had nothing, and he pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and he's become a very wealthy man. Why can't you guys do that?" And he said that directly to me. And I said, well, let's examine what you just said. Do you realize that when your great-grandfather arrived here, that he was given 640 acres of land, free of charge, and he got clear title to it without any payment whatsoever, so long as he farmed it for 10 years? Did you know that? He said, no. Is that true? I said, yes, it is. It's called the Dominion Lands Act of 1876. Land was given freely to all settlers who came here from Europe from that point forward. And it was given freely, and as long as they farmed it for a period of time, they got free title to it. And that 640 acres of land could be given to different members of the family, so that the wife could get 640 acres of land as well. The son could get 640 acres of land, because the Dominion Land Act wanted to ensure that the land was being utilized for purposes that benefited Canadian society as they saw it at that time. And so taking over Indigenous land was common practice. In fact, it was a governed, sanctioned activity by the Government of Canada, and they encouraged it to happen. And I said to this man, and your great-grandfather benefited from that. He probably sold the land after a while. He probably made money if he sold it. That was far more than the rest of Canadian society received in their salaried positions. And he probably used that money to invest in other things that earned him more money. So he became wealthy off the backs of Indigenous peoples whose land was taken away by the Government of Canada in order to be given free of charge to white settlers who came here from Europe. So don't tell me that we should learn to do what you do, because if we did, then we would take your land away from you now, and we would give it back at 640 acres per person to the Indigenous people from whom it was originally taken. And do you really want us to do that? He said, of course not. I said, well, why do you think it was okay to do it to begin with? And from that point in time, we didn't talk. But the perspective that people have of Indigenous people has been affected by this history, often unconsciously. At the time that I was appointed a judge in 1988, there was a big public event, of course, around my appointment, my swearing in, and a large number of people came to the gathering, and congratulations flowed freely. About a week or two after my appointment, though, I was sitting around a table with other judges, and one of the judges there said, "Well, Sinclair, everybody knows the only reason you were appointed a judge is because you're a native guy." And I said, without even thinking or blinking an eye, I said, "Yep, and everybody knows you were appointed a judge because you're a white guy." And I was a better lawyer than you, because I fought you in court on a number of cases, and I always won. So don't talk to me about favoritism. Talk to me about the fact that this system is bent so badly that it only allows certain people to be eligible to get to this level. Today, the Supreme Court of Canada acknowledged its first Indigenous appointed judge at the Supreme Court. Imagine that. From 1867 until now, there has not been one Indigenous judge in the Supreme Court of Canada. I find that fact astounding. Astounding. And now they're patting themselves on the back because they've got one. They should have at least 4 in order for it to be effective. Because most of the legal issues that they face today are about lawsuits involving Indigenous rights, Indigenous people, and that perspective needs to have an Indigenous view. And I have warned my friend, Michelle Abonsawin, that she's got a tough role to play at that level because she's going to get involved in a lot of fights. But she's a niche woman, and they're tough. I think that the fight is in good hands. But she will need some help, and that court needs some help, and we have a lot to do. But when you think about the children and the fact that one of the reasons why there have been such few appointments is because our children were never allowed the opportunities to be part of this Canadian society on our own terms, maintaining our identity, our languages, our culture, because of residential school and the way the public schools berated us just for being Indigenous. When you think about that, you can understand why the biggest form of racism that we suffer in this country is systemic racism, where the system itself is founded upon principles and thinking and ways of doing things that are founded from ways of thinking about Indigenous people in a racially motivated, hated way. And that's why for such a long time, survivors at residential schools were not heard when they tried to tell their stories. That's why the single most important thing that the TRC did was we gave voice to the survivors who came and spoke to us. Now, we could not get a public broadcaster to broadcast our proceedings. We couldn't get the CBC or CTV or any of the public TV stations to broadcast our proceedings because we wanted the public to hear and see what survivors were saying. We couldn't get it. So we got around them through social media. We went to the internet and we broadcast every single one of our hearings and national events on the internet. And eventually, by the time that we finished our work in 2015, there were thousands upon thousands of people, not only in Canada, but around the world, who were listening and watching survivors speaking to us at those hearings. And they were telling stories, including stories about children who died in the schools and about how they were unceremoniously dumped into grave sites. And sometimes, often, their graves were not marked. Often, they would have more than one child in a grave. Often, they were separated in the cemetery from the graves where the people who worked in the schools were buried. And they had headstones, and they had grave markers, but the children did not have that. And people were finally beginning to think, well, maybe that did happen. But what sealed the deal, of course, was the discovery that children were being dealt with in that way. Because now we know that there are bodies in the ground that need to be addressed. And there are many issues that arise from that knowledge for us as Indigenous people too, that we need to be careful about and we need to think about. First of all, of course, there is the fact that discovering that there is a child of your family who actually died somewhere and is buried in the ground leads to a different kind of trauma than the trauma you feel when the child actually dies in your community, dies in your family, and you bury that child in your community. The sense of loss is similar. Losing a child is never good. Losing a child is the hardest experience that anybody will ever face in the course of their lives. But when you lose somebody and you don't know what happened, you don't know where they are, you don't even know whether or not they were properly buried. That's troubling. That leads to a form of grief that is never resolved. And that unresolved grief is a different kind of grief than the grief that you feel when you know and participate in the burial of your own child or your family's child. And we need to understand that. The individual who lost a child, the parents who lost a child, they have that grief too. But when they don't know what happened to their child, that's difficult. When we were holding our hearings in the north, among the Inuit people, we often heard from parents whose children were taken away to residential schools in far distant communities and never came home. And they would always ask us, can you help us find our child? We think that maybe he might have gone to Vancouver, or he might have gone to Edmonton, or he might have gone to Montreal, or he might have gone to the States, but we don't know what happened to him. And you know, I think, you can sense what that is like, never to know. When I was 16 years old, my brother was murdered. And a fight that occurred on a train, and his body was thrown off the train. And he was so badly beaten that when they brought his body home, it was unrecognizable. I didn't recognize it. I didn't know that, and I couldn't accept that that was him in the casket. And I tell people that even to this day, I think he's still alive, because that body that we buried wasn't him. I'm convinced of that. And when the phone rings, once in a while I catch myself thinking, that's him. He's calling. Or when I'm walking down the street and I see somebody who looks like him from the back, I'll try hard to get in front of him in order to look at him, and I think that's him, but it's not. Because you work and walk and live with that unresolved grief, that lack of belief, that lack of acceptance that always haunts you. It's not the same as when I lost my other brother, because I was with my other brother when he died in the hospital. I held his hand for the last day of his life, and I talked to him until he left. And when I participated in his burial, I knew that that was him. I knew that that's where he wanted to go. I knew that that's where he is now. And so that has resolved itself for me. It's a different kind of grief, though, because he still comes and plays tricks on me in my dreams. But it's not the same as hearing a phone call and wondering if maybe that's my other brother. Maybe he's calling. Maybe he's reaching out. And when I pick up the phone and it's somebody speaking to me in a different language from a different country trying to sell me something, I get rather angry. Because maybe he's trying to call while I'm talking to them. But that grief is a different kind of grief. The trauma is a different kind of trauma. And the trauma that we all feel as a collective from the fact that the children are still on the ground and were so badly dealt with and treated is a trauma that runs throughout our nations, all of us. And we have to do what we can in order to fix that, to help our people heal from what it is that we know. And that's a real challenge. That may take us more than 1 or 2 generations, but we have to address it. We have to do something about it. But in the same way, when people cannot accept that that is their child in the ground, when they don't know, I don't know how they can be convinced that it is. Because I don't know how I'll ever be convinced that my brother is in that cemetery plot where he was placed. Because I don't know that that's him. Because it's unresolved, that grief. But here's the real difficult part, is what is this going to do to you? What does this do to you? When we were doing the initial work of the TRC back in 2009, I told each of the commissioners before we even started, and we hadn't even gotten an office yet, we didn't even have any staff, I said, I want each one of you to find a spiritual advisor and to find a medical advisor and to find someone who will commit to working with you throughout this work that we're going to do, because this work is going to be difficult. And you also need to find someone who will work with your families, because your families are going to see your pain and feel your pain, but you can't talk about that. You don't know how to express that pain that you're feeling, that difficulty that you're feeling. There will be many, many days in a row when you just can't explain what you're going through, because it is hurting you. It will hurt you. My wife said to me one time, I see you sitting out on our deck, and you sit there for the entire day, and all you do is just stare up at the trees. You stare at the fence. You stare at the grass. You're just sitting there, and you're just looking. and I don't know what you're going through. And I said to her, I don't know how I can tell you. As I said at one of our gatherings with our elders, I said, I don't know what to do when you can't stop thinking about this. You just can't stop thinking about this. And you may find yourself in that situation. So even as those who are helping people heal from this trauma, you need to understand that you have to have those who can help you deal with what it is that gets placed upon you, that you yourself will undergo and experience. Because this is going to be difficult work. This is going to be challenging work. This is important work. And it needs to be done. And if you find that it's more than you can offer, then step back from time to time. Step back and let others take over some of that work if you feel that it is becoming too much for you. Do not sacrifice yourself and your family to this challenge, because there are so many people out there who are willing to do what they can to help. And let them help. Let them help you, but also let them help the community. The hardest part about being a helper like that is thinking that everything depends on you, and it doesn't. You are an important player in all of this. Never underestimate that. But at the same time, you have an obligation to ensure that you do not get burned out by this, that you do not become emotionally neutralized to the point where you stop reacting to it. You need to be able to be strong and involved throughout all of this, and be active, and get angry. Get angry. Don't be afraid to get angry. But also make sure that you focus that anger in the right way. And do not let this harm you. Do not let this harm your family. Do not let this harm your community. And do what you can to ensure that those little children, wherever they may be, are discovered. Miigwech. Thank you very much.
Stay here. Don't leave yet. We're gonna take you to the middle of that. Right here. I'm just gonna say, yeah, to the middle. Honorable Sinclair, I just want to say thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for always speaking the truth, for teaching me about speaking the truth and how to amplify that truth. We are honored to continue the work on behalf of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and from the staff of the center, the survivors that we work with, and the Canadians at large. We are honored to have you with us this evening. Miigwech.